next speaker before our break, Lois Holloway, an associate professor at UNSW and medical physicist that leads the medical physics group at the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research. She runs the AI working group for ASCP-SCM. Lois also leads the computer-assisted theragnostics AUS-CAD team, which works on developing prognostic models for radiotherapy, particularly for situations where randomized clinical trials evidence is limited. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me today. It's really, really great to have the opportunity to be here with this audience. It's a little bit different to my usual audience. I am super keen for questions, super keen for any thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to big ideas and beers later. I think that's a fantastic idea. So I'm presenting this on behalf of quite a number of people, in particular Rob Finnegan, who did a PhD with our group and some postdoc work after that, and he's really done most of the grunt work on developing this segmentation model that we've been utilising and exploring the potential for in radiation oncology. And really just a cast of thousands to say thank you for a number of people that were involved in the model development, and then a key group of people that are involved in implementing and looking at how we might be able to use that more effectively. So I want to talk in two spaces, one in model development and how we've gone about developing the model that we've been looking at, and then very briefly just looking at what the impact of having some consistency has given us the opportunity to explore in radiation oncology. So by way of background, for those of you that haven't seen one before, this is an image of a linear accelerator, and this is the system that we use to produce high energy radiation beams for our patient treatments in radiation oncology. And there's benefit for patients in breast cancer, in lung cancer, and in esophageal cancer, and in another number of other smaller cancers in this space as well. The nature of delivering radiation oncology to treat the cancer means that we also deliver, in some instances more, in many instances less, but we also deliver radiation dose to our heart. And we have demonstrated more recently that there is known risks associated with that, and there is a growing body of evidence as we get more data about how we might be able to consider that and to gain more knowledge in that space. So by way of background, one particular study came out in 2013. It was an epidemiological study looking at a very large cohort of patients that had received radiation dose during their breast cancer treatment compared to a cohort of patients that hadn't received radiation dose as part of their breast cancer treatment. And what was seen here was a really clear correlation between the mean dose to the heart and the risk of coronary events afterwards. And this really has kicked off a lot of questions in radiation oncology space. Digging back into that data more recently, it would appear, you can see from the image on the left-hand side here, from a group in the Netherlands, that actually there is probably even a higher risk for some patients. So, and even more importance to understand this. And a number of studies that have looked at different radiation doses to different subsegments of the heart. So the question we were asking ourselves was, how can we consistently delineate these structures, and how can we then utilize that information to be able to develop these risk prediction models? So starting with a whole heart, we then wanted to be able to look at the cardiac chambers. We wanted to be able to look at the great vessels, at the coronary arteries, at the heart valves, and at the conduction nodes. And I'm sure for many of you in the room, you know these areas far better than I do. But these were the areas that we wanted to be able to dig into, to be able to explore and see what our radiation doses were doing in this space, and whether we could gain a better understanding of why these events were occurring due to our radiation dose, and more importantly, whether we could then use that information to better derive how we could treat our patients. So The motivation was really looking at these large studies and being able to have consistent labelling. To be able to look in clinical translation, so if we do develop predictive models that are really useful, how do we know that when we're implementing these in the clinic that we have consistency, whether we're contouring the same in Adelaide as we are in Sydney, and making sure that we can therefore follow through that and we can make the right decisions for our patients. And looking into the future, there are a number of areas, and one in particular, which is actually looking at treating cardiac disease with radiation beams. It's an incredibly novel area. It has quite incredible potential just because of the lack of surgical requirements for patient treatments. But as you can understand, the risks are also incredibly high. So it's really important that if we're going to progress down this path, that we have as good an understanding as we can possibly get. So our process here was to develop an open source model because we wanted to be able to use this really broadly. And one of the challenges in that space was how we thought about the ethics in how we were going about it. And obviously to be able to provide this cardiac segmentation model. So for our automatic segmentation, we have the same challenges that you see in most data problems. We have different patient cohorts, we have different anatomy, different setup, existing challenges for some of the smaller structures, and we really needed scalability because we wanted to be able to use it on a very large number of patients. So what we've ended up with is a hybrid segmentation model. So we've taken a number of different approaches to how we develop these structures and how we do this auto segmentation approach. So in module 1, we are looking at, we developed a deep learning approach, and this is really to get the outer cardiac segmentation. So we used a CNN to be able to really use a data-driven technique, and we were able to utilize a very large amount of clinical data. So looking at the patterns that we were seeing at the edge of the structures and then being able to define that. One of the things that we did in that process, and I haven't talked a lot here, is that we also had a large number of clinicians that gave us those contours. And so one of the things that we've been able to incorporate in that model is also uncertainties in where those contours are lying. And that's really important when we're looking at very large data sets. Once we have our deep learning segmentation for our outer cardiac approach, we have the substructures that we've had a number of clinicians to be able to contour, and then we've been able to use an atlas-based approach to be able to put in the inner structures within our cardiac mapping. And this was a much more realistic approach to use due simply to the fact that we didn't have hundreds and hundreds of data sets that had all of the substructure information that we'd really like to be available. And then we wanted to be able to look at how we could define some of these small structures. So some of these you can see fairly well on particular imaging approaches. So with a gated contrast enhanced cardiac CT, you can see these reasonably well. With some MR approaches, you can also see some of these structures fairly well. But in the problem that we were looking at, which is a radiation oncology data set, we generally have what we call a planning CT, which is a standard CT, but we use it for the purposes of radiation oncology treatment. It's generally non-contrasted. It may be lung-gated, but very, very rarely heart-gated. And so these images certainly don't have the clarity that some of the other approaches do. Moving forward, it may well be that we have evidence that we need to be able to improve the heart imaging that we're doing in radiation oncology. But for our retrospective data, these are the types of images that we're working with. So the approach that we took with the small structures was to look at geometric models. And this really, again, similar to Chris's presentation where you had multiple clinicians that were contouring, when we got multiple clinicians to contour these small structures, they were generally within the same space, but they weren't always overlapping. And so when we really came down to it, it made far more sense as we were chatting to the clinicians to really be looking at some geometrical definitions. They might not be perfect as far as where the anatomy goes, but at a minimum, they're consistent. And that means that we could use that over a retrospective data set, and we can use these pushing forward. So for the valves, you can see here we were able to define the structures looking at the segments that we already had defined in the heart. In this instance, we had a number of little discs that were used, and we defined what the diameter of those discs were relative to the other structures in the heart that we were actually exploring. For the conduction nodes, we were looking at a region. So we were looking at the different spheres that we wanted to be able to explore. And when we were looking at the arteries, one of the challenges that we have in radiation oncology, it's no longer a limitation with our current software systems, but in software systems until very recently, generally images were only contoured in the axial slices. And so that means you get contours that are down through the layers, but they don't always flow exactly the way that you think that they might. If you then converted to your other planes, then you end up with structures that appear to be a little bit going all over the place. So what we were able to do was to be able to spline through that information and then to be able to work out where these arteries should be going in a consistent approach and in line with the broader data set. So that was the approach that we took with the arteries. Following that, we ended up with some spatial smoothing so that we had consistent structures. We were looking for anatomical consistency, and we were looking, as I mentioned before, at accuracy that was close to our intra-observer variability. So looking at the variation that we were seeing with different clinician contours. And we found a really nice match between our automatic segmentation and our manual contours. So we were confident at that point that we had something that was going to be reproducible moving forward. But reality is, we also knew that most of our patients were not as consistently shaped as each other. And when we put them on the imaging bed, we didn't always get as good a consistency in our imaging as we wanted either. So we started with a breast cohort. We also explored a lung cohort, and we very consciously went about looking at some what I'll term outlier cases where we knew we had problems in the approaches that we were taking. So we looked at segmentations that were where we had tumour really close to the heart, so where contrast was more challenging. We looked at really challenging artefacts. And in radiation oncology, we take different approaches to how we set our patients up. So we explored some of those as well. And we were able to validate that our model worked reasonably well for the majority of these cases. And perhaps as importantly, one of the factors that we put in was a measure of how well our model was working. So we could flag cases where proactively we knew that our model wasn't doing what we would like. So the next challenge that we had was that we wanted to be able to deploy this model across a number of different departments and a number of different data sets. And so we wanted reproducibility across those data sets. So then we found ourselves looking back at the ethics that we had undertaken, I don't know, it was probably 5 or so years prior, and looking at it and going, oh, all right, I can't share this data with the rest of the world. I don't have permission for that. So we looked at what the risks were in actually being able to then be able to push this data out more widely. We looked at geometric models. So obviously when we're looking at disks and spheres, there's no risk associated there. That's pretty clean. We can do with that as we like. At the other end of the scale, we could look at an ATLAS set. And an ATLAS set very explicitly requires you to share other patient data sets. So that was obviously not a goer. Deep learning, somewhere in the middle, there definitely are papers out there where it's possible to reverse engineer, if you like. And so there was a bit of concern in that front as well. So the approach that we took was to do a knowledge transfer from the model that we had developed on our local data sets where we had ethics to work with the data locally, but we didn't have approval to share the data. And we also cross-trained that with an open access data set, so a public data set, so that we then had a model that was trained on the public data set so that we could then share this information. And moving forward, you might have thought it would make more sense to have undertaken the development of this model on the public data set in the first place. And perhaps that would be an ideal scenario. But in reality, you don't always have the flexibility that you would like on those public data sets, although he's hoping we will get to that eventually. So we did a validation looking at a local data set with manual contours and pushed that onto our open access data set and looked at the dose information that we're interested in. So in radiation oncology, really one of the key things that we're interested in is how much these contours impact on our radiation doses. And we found that taken on the local model or on the open access model, we were able to get fairly equivalent results, certainly within the uncertainties that we were expecting. So we demonstrated that for the purpose of what we were after, we've generated a model which can now be fairly widely used and can push forward. And for those that are keen, we do have a GitHub repository, super keen for anyone that's interested in using it or exploring with it, and certainly super keen to help if that's. So as far as our model development goes, we've been able to develop a cardiac model. We've been able to do a knowledge transfer between local data set and a public data set, and we now have a model that can be fairly broadly shared. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'll be very fast here. Very quickly, I just wanted to put up some work in progress, which is also on the GitHub. So this is the 17 segment left ventricle data sets. And part of that is the broader project that we're working on, where we're addressing the problem of challenges in accessing data in radiation oncology with a federated network. And in our federated network, the data remains at the local institutions, so that overcomes many of the ethics challenges, but we're able to use models across all of those data sets. And in an iterative approach, we can then develop predictive models that incorporate all of these. And very briefly, we were able to have a look at some of the clinical consistency. And what we found was that for our breast cancer patients that are generally receiving lower radiation doses, then the differences that we were seeing in clinical segmentations were not so critical. With our lung cancer patients, at least at a first pass, we found that the contours that were being done at the clinics versus our auto contour were different enough that you would be looking at potentially giving a patient a slightly different risk score for the models that are out there, as determined by the way that their clinician had contoured that heart volume. And so this really kind of demonstrates the need for us to have a consistent approach in the way that we're moving forward. So just in conclusion, we have a cardiac substructure model. Really keen to talk to anyone that's interested in using it, and please explore the GitHub link. And hopefully this will give us something consistent in radiation oncology space, but potentially outside that as well. Thank you.
Great. Question right away. Here we go.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. Especially because a couple of weeks ago, I had a friend who's a radiation oncologist from the UK, and she was telling me she spends a couple of hours every day just doing these little contours. And I said, in the cardiac sphere, we've got a program, we press a button and it auto contours everything like in 2 seconds. Surely there must be something like that in the radiation oncology space. And she said she didn't know about it either, or the NHS was too cheap to buy something like that. I know you're talking about contouring the structures for the heart. Do you know of any auto segmentation models for the internal mammary artery or something like that that's already out there, or is that something that is something surely it'll save people a lot of time if there isn't something out there that you guys might be potentially keen on working on?
Yes. So very active space. So there are a number of research groups that are working in that space, including ours. Yeah, there are a number of commercial products that are out there. The deep learning tools are starting to come out into the commercial products, and I think it will be the deep learning tools that will really have impact. I guess prior to the deep learning tools, we've had atlases, and they give a reasonable starting point, but what happens a lot of the time is that we'll put those tools in front of our clinicians and they'll look at them and they'll flick through them and they'll go, yeah, don't like that, delete, and they'll start again. I think with the deep learning tools, they will be, they are a level better. And I think we will get to the point where that will change. The other factor that's coming in radiation oncology is a lot more automated approaches to how we treat, which really needs contours to be done quickly and without the, in a truly adaptive process, which is where we're heading, we don't have an hour for a clinician to contour. So the tools are going to have to make that jump, and the clinical community are going to have to make that jump as well, because the patient will be better off if we can adapt in a timely fashion, even if our contour might be slightly different to the way that the clinician concerned wants. So yeah, there's definitely tools out there. Very happy to talk things through.
Follow-up question? Sorry.
So totally unrelated to that first question, but with the data that you were trying to access, that we've got so much data in the hospital systems, but the ethics kind of stops us from sharing that kind of data. What ways do you think we can? Because the EMR system in the hospital is forever changing, and there should be some kind of planning that we can the national health system can do together with the research people that are interested in doing this research, to structure it so that we can clean up some of that data and utilize it in a bigger fashion. Really, do you know that is that something that's already in the process? Or
I mean, across a number of jurisdictions internationally and in Australia, there is a push towards data lakes. So kind of pulling all of the EMR data and at least having it in a system where you could access it. Actually having that data clean and available, that's like a whole nother layer. There's a lot of discussions going on, but unfortunately, I think we're many years away from that, although there definitely are pockets of research groups and clinicians that are working incredibly well together. And hopefully that will provide the, look, we can do this, and then perhaps it gets shared more broadly. Yeah, something we need to solve.
All right.
I'm going to be slightly selfish and ask two questions. Well, I'll answer one first. The UK Biobank, have a read about that. That's the biggest data set for EMR records, and a lot of work's been put into that. I have two questions. The first one is, how do you make contouring more palatable to doctors that don't contour? Because I talked to a lot of the RO guys. Yeah, you just get your contours and you blah, 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 blah. But if you don't work in radiation oncology, like a neurologist, a cardiologist, they don't routinely sit there and contour. So how do you sell it? And I guess the other question is, what do you do when you don't have a publicly available data set? What's the plan C or D?
So for clinicians that don't contour, I mean, no different to anything else that you're trying to sell them. You've got to convince them of the end product, and you've got to demonstrate that if we can do this here and now, then we're all going to be better off moving forward. We have the same discussions when we want clinicians to generate multiple contours so that we can develop algorithms to make their lives easier in the future. And it's often a hard sell. But once you get to that point, then that's great. Then there's excitement. In terms of the data access problem, I think we're, particularly in Australia, I think we're going to be a long way away from just having data that's publicly accessible. And with my kind of consumer group hat on, I would say that's not unreasonable. But there certainly are a number of approaches like our federated learning platform. So where we've got data sets across a number of centres in Australia, the data stays. And we can then learn off that data as long as you've got local buy-in, and that's where the collaboration and the teamwork has to happen, otherwise it all falls over. But if you've got that, like, we can access tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of records, and that will then give us the ability to push forward. But that has to be done as a community. If that's not done as a community, then we go nowhere. And we need that locally, because taking models that have been developed elsewhere and just turning them on in our clinics without testing them in our setting, I think runs a very risk of bias that we just don't want.
Right, we have another question. Do you want to say it and maybe I repeat? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a role for machine learning in brachytherapy. I think there's a machine learning opportunity across the board in healthcare. For those of you that don't know, brachytherapy is where we use internal sources and we have a radiation source that's placed inside the body rather than external beam where it's coming from outside. We still have the same dosimetry challenges where we're trying to work out where those sources should be placed to get an ideal dose distribution. We still have the same challenges in terms of wanting those contours to be as accurate as we can so that we can make those decisions. And we still have challenges in knowing what we would like our ideal dose distribution to be based on outcomes rather than just based on anatomy. So yeah, I think it won't be exactly the same, but incredibly similar challenges, and I'm sure machine learning will provide great solutions. Yeah.
Great. All right. Any last questions? Okay, excellent.